So in this lecture, we're going to be covering racism and colorism. So just as a disclaimer for this lecture, we are going to be talking about some sensitive topics, and I do want to be as sensitive as I possibly can about that. So I'm providing this disclaimer. Um, when it comes to racism and colorism, these are some of the more contested topics within public discourse. So when we talk about them in daily conversations, there tends to be a lot of passion behind each side. So what I hope that folks have in listening to this lecture is a sense of openness and um, hearing the information related to this particular systems. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover racism and colorism separately, and then talk about some ideologies and microaggressions that maintain these specific oppressions. Before we get started into the lecture, we're going to have to talk about some terms that are really important for you to know. One of them is race. Now, when we talk about race, we recognize that there is no biological construct of race. Instead, race is a social-cultural or socially constructed identity, if you will, and it's reinforced by institutions, social norms and practices, and even reinforced at the interpersonal individual level through behaviors and attitudes. So when we look at race throughout human history, there isn't a documentation of race up until we started seeing the system around white supremacy and racism. And I'll get into why that would be in a minute. Another one that's up here that typically is used interchangeably with race is ethnicity. So ethnicity is really in reference to your nationality, your country of origin. So this is more along the lines of some attitudes, beliefs, not related, but shared with other people of a certain ethnic identity. So while race and ethnicity are used hand in hand, it's very important to know that they are distinct concepts and constructs. Racism. So racism has a wide variety of different definitions. So on one hand, racism one specific definition of racism looks at individual behavior, suggesting that anybody can be racist. So it looks at individual behaviors and attitudes and goes from there. On another hand, the other definition of racism relates to systemic and institutional roles and as well as individual behavior. So for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to adopt racism as a system of advantage and disadvantage based upon race. And with this specific definition, we're going to be looking at the institutional, interpersonal, and individual levels of racism. So we're not going to exclude one over the other or emphasize one over the other. Instead, we're going to recognize the contributions that each plays within racism. And then lastly, white supremacy. So white supremacy is the overarching system where racism operates under. So it's the overarching one. If you imagine like the stage bosses in a video game, this is like the final boss, okay? And with white supremacy, it's really just a system that maintains advantages for peoples who are racialized as white. Now, these advantages are social, economic, and political. And white supremacy just for your information, it's been historically created, and it's been maintained in the present through institutions and systems and um, interpersonal and individual behaviors. So white supremacy, final boss; racism, stage boss. And when we get to the end of the quarter, you're going to learn that there is actually like um, a bigger matrix than white supremacy. But for now, white supremacy, big boss, final boss; racism, stage boss; race is just a character. So this is the addressing model. I presented the addressing model within the past several lectures now. So what we're really going to be focusing on in this lecture are ethnicity, race, so the E here, if you will. And then we're also going to be looking at indigenous heritage and nationality. Now, I want y'all to make note, there's one important thing that is not up here, and it's something that we're going to be talking about today. And if you guess skin color, you are absolutely correct, or hair type. Either one of those answers are appropriate. So with skin color, people don't identify themselves as far as their skin tone or as far as their hair texture. From what I have seen, I haven't seen a document asking me about my skin tone or my hair texture. And really, just to be really clear about that, when we talk about skin tone and we talk about race in particular, they typically go hand in hand. And a lot of people assume that colorism is the same thing as racism. However, it's really important to know that racism and colorism, they operate hand in hand. While they do share some similarities, they are distinct systems of oppression. So across the globe, we have documented evidence of racism. However, for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the history of racism and just racism in general within US America. So when it comes to racism, we found it in the origins of the nation through the dehumanization and marginalization of people of color. So within the U.S. American history, within the earlier parts of it, colonization was like it was the first process or establishment of racism, if you will, within U.S. America. And it started with the attempted extermination of indigenous peoples. Of note, the way that this would occur, they would have the direct attempts, such as killings or transmission of diseases such as syphilis, or any of the other infectious diseases that were observed in Europe. Another way, through assimilation. So in some cases, there were children of the tribes that were taken to missionary schools, and what would occur is that the hair would, in some cases, the hair would be cut. There would be a de-emphasis on their cultural identity, and an emphasis on the adoption of European culture. And then some of the times these children would be sent back to their tribes to teach their tribes the European culture, and at the same time de-emphasize their culture as well. So that was one way that this happened, and that was like the first touchdown of racism within US America. Further was the enslavement of indigenous peoples. So within that exploitation of indigenous peoples and the displacement, there was this enslavement of indigenous American folk. And what ended up happening is that there was this there was another group that were, and the way that it was conceptualized is workforce, right? There was another group that could work twice as much with little amounts of efforts, and those were the African peoples. Um, and that was to be quite clear, that was the reasoning as to why there was this switch from uh, the exploitation or the over exploitation of indigenous folks to African peoples. Um, so you had African peoples being taken from their lands, um, and being brought over to U.S. America, or really just to the Americas, for slavery. And what we do know from the transatlantic slave trade is that it was a brutal one. Chattel slavery was a big economic. It was a very big economic uh, process. It made money. Uh, and so with the enslavement of African peoples, in essence, what was going on, uh, African peoples were serving as the machines to make products. And at the same time, not only were they really, to be quite frank, they were not seen as people. Instead, they were dehumanized and seen as property. And as U.S. American history has went on, with the expansion of the U.S. American land, we did see the displacement of Mexican and indigenous peoples. And with this specific displacement, we also saw the appropriation of land. And uh, with this taking of land, you saw indigenous peoples and Mexican folks being labeled as foreign, being labeled as the other, and also being exploited at the same time. So, in particular, for the displacement, uh, it was fueled by manifest destiny. And if you look up manifest destiny, that was within, at least what I was taught within history. So the way that I learned manifest destiny was that it wasn't a document. It was this idea, this belief in this God-given right to expand the United States from east to west. So this was like one of the main reasons as to why U.S. Americas was expanding uh, westward. And as a result of that expansion, um, you also, in addition to that, you did see a rise in technologies, um, such as like that of the railroad system. And with the railroad system, you had Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrants being exploited for their labor. So not being paid, being treated horribly, bad work environment, and at the same time being labeled as the other, being marginalized. So when we look at the history of racism taken together, what we do see is the marginalization, dehumanization, and the exploitation, and even further, in extreme cases, violence against peoples of color. Okay, and once again, to be quite once again to include, it was also important to remember that when we talk about racism during that time period, a lot of times it was enacted by uh, by white wealthy folk, um, and those who had a lot of power at that time were predominantly white, man, cisgender, and wealthy. And in some cases, you did have the oppression, not in some cases, you did have the oppression of um, working class white folks, poverty stricken white folks as well. And uh, there were discussions or possible resistances to the wealthy white elite whenever you had this allegiance between African slaves, indigenous peoples, as well and with working class white folks, in order to uh, dismantle that resistance. The wealthy white elite would provide jobs to the working class white folks, providing them with some social power, despite the fact that they did not get economic or political power as a result. So really, this was more along the lines of social privilege, going to these folks and saying, hey, because you are white, you are a lot better than the African slave or the indigenous folk or the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino folks, Latinx folks. So it's the fact that you identify as white, you are better than the other people of color, excuse me. And you even saw that with European immigrants. So later within US American history, you did see a lot of folks from different countries immigrating to the United States. And when it came to Black and brown immigrants, they were not expanded, or they were not provided with the same advantages as those who were European and white. So they were treated as though they were uh, as the Americans, people of color, and they were subjected to the same legal consequences experienced by people of color. Now, with European white immigrants, this was a little bit different. So initially, there was this acceptance of folks who were from Great Britain. However, as white European folks came over, there was this sense of there was a lot of like territory like bias, like, oh, you're from Ireland, you Irish person, or oh, you're from Russia, or you're Polish, so forth and so on. And they weren't immediately accepted. However, as time went on, these white European immigrants, the expansion of whiteness, the construct of whiteness, included, and not only just included, but was expanded to white European immigrants. So in essence, while they might have been Irish or Italian or Russian or Polish, as long as they were white, they were able to be, they were able to have the advantages associated with whiteness. So when we look at the history of racism, we do recognize the historical advantages of whiteness. And I have these listed here. So if you see where my cursor is there, so taken together, when we look at the advantages of whiteness, they provided power to those who were considered white. And it's something to make note, because in the very beginning, when we look at racism, the definition of what was white was very, very narrow, but it soon became expansive, including from folks from Great Britain to folks from Scotland, Ireland, Russia, so forth and so on. And it's also important to note, and just for your FYI, the definition of white, you still notice that today. While the other definitions of racial categories have expanded, the most expansive is pretty much white. Of note, and FYI, some definitions of whiteness do include North Africa. So that's just for your information. So that's something just to make note of. Um, some definitions of white do include uh, uh, regions of North Africa. So I'm curious what folks think about that. Reflect on that for a minute. Yeah. So taken together with the history of racism, there have been like government interventions to reduce explicit, overt racism. So that old-fashioned racism, calling somebody some derogatory racial names, or lynching, killing people because of their race or ethnicity. Uh, in an attempt to do that, what we saw was that there was a decrease in overt prejudice. However, what you saw at the same time was that implicit biases did not go down. So where explicit explicit prejudice decreases, implicit prejudice still lingered on, and it lingered into the institutions and practices and systems that do appear colorblind. Um, it was long argued that the criminal justice system has been colorblind. However, what we do know, and from research, there is still implicit biases when it comes to sentencing. You have Black or brown offenders who are more likely to receive harsher sentences than white offenders. So that's something to make note. Another one is the racial wealth gap. Um, while you have like substantial places where people of color are working, there's still something going on with that wealth gap, and it's actually um, depending upon where you're looking at it, it's getting bigger and bigger. So the way that it started out uh, is in reference to GI Bills. So those who are eligible for GI Bills were typically white families. And because they were able to get those GI Bills, getting those loans, they were able to, work some stuff out for their family and build their wealth compared to the Black family. Our families of color, to be quite honest, and that at that point in time when we did have at that time you had segregation, you had predominantly white schools that have existed for quite some time. They're already wealthy. When you get a degree, we know that your economic worth goes up as well. And for a long time, there wasn't the allowance of Black or brown folk going into those schools. Instead, you had predominantly, you had historically Black, historically Latinx, or Asian schools pop up as well in order to educate those groups. However, when integration occurred, everyone was like, oh, yeah, it's gonna fix the gap. Well, no, it didn't. There wasn't anything done in place to fix that gap already. So as we've gone through time, that wealth gap has substantially increased. And what we do know now is that when it comes to the payment for let me back up a little bit. So for every dollar that a white family is able to bring in, Black or brown families earn less than that. So when we think about the wealth gap, or this idea that everybody in America can make it, that's not entirely true. And what it gets at is this idea of meritocracy, right? And we talked about that. But even further, it's fueling this idea of color blindness. So when we think about what it means to be colorblind, We think about, let me switch over here. When we think about what it means to be colorblind, we uh, tend to stop talking about the role that race plays. So up here I have, I pulled this from a study done by Neville and colleagues, and I'll have the article for you to read on supplementary links. But when it comes to colorblind ideology, a lot of times you hear statements such as racism isn't a thing anymore, I don't see color, uh, race isn't important, um, we have a black president now, so racism is over. And another one that has popped up in recent years, all lives matter. So to be, while these statements, they sound nice, right? They sound very pleasing. Um, and these are the statements that should be made. However, we know that these statements are not entirely true. Um, what they typically do, they typically deny the role that race plays within someone's experience. And it also de-emphasizes the role that racism plays when it comes to power and opportunity. So here there are two dimensions, two characteristics for colorblind ideology, color evasion and power evasion. So when it comes to these two, it looks very different in white folks and in people of color. Typically within predominantly white communities, when these statements are used, they're used to um, reduce racial prejudice. However, we know that this doesn't work. And whenever these statements are used, it's in response to someone's accusations of racism or calling out of racial inequality. And it serves more so as a strategy to really get away from the discomfort within interracial interactions as well. Now, when it comes to people of color, it's in reference to discomfort in discussing racial issues, getting away from that. Now, power evasion, the way that it looks in predominantly white communities, um, it's to it's to endorse the stronger beliefs in a just world and meritocracy. So when we say things like everyone has an equal chance to succeed in society, that's basically saying that racism doesn't stop you anymore. When we do have evidence to suggest that, well, it kind of does. Uh, so that's how it looks within white communities that are endorsing this ideology, uh, really to keep the status quo as the status quo. Now, for people of color, what this does look like is there's this increased internalized oppression. So accepting the status quo as it is and staying where you are at that point in time, if you're at the, when you're at the bottom, or at that point of acceptance. So with people of color and with white folks, colorblind ideology looks, while they look fairly different, they both get at either evading the role that the role that race plays within power, as well as someone's experience. So what I don't want you to hear is to not recognize how we are all alike. That's really important. But it's also important to recognize how certain differences between people facilitate their experience. So it's recognizing similarities, appreciating people's differences, and knowing how that impacts that person's experience, and also impacts their reach for power. And another, just one more word on it. When it comes to statements such as all lives matter, with All Lives Matter, that was formed in response to Black Lives Matter, and we'll talk about Black Lives Matter in a moment. With All Lives Matter, it's the way that it was formulated. It was formulated in response to the calling out uh, of racial inequality, racial profiling, police brutality experienced by people of color within the U.S. America. So it's not to say that when it comes to All Lives Matter, yes, everybody does matter. But when we start saying that, when someone is saying, hey, I'm experiencing this, and I think it's because of my race, or I think it's because of my, or because of my race, or because of my skin tone or my skin color, and we say, oh, well, that sucks. Everybody experiences some kind of racism, and it's not just you. That's in essence what that's saying. That's what it communicates. It communicates that everybody in some way experiences these type of oppressions, and that's just life. So it invalidates that person. So I just want to make it clear that when we say all lives matter, it's moving away from someone's experience and validating their experience. So we've talked about the history of racism, how it's maintained, and I want to be really clear that there have been resistances to institutional racism and white supremacy all throughout the history of America. When we think about the abolitionists working to assist enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples within we talk about the civil rights movement. You had the Black Panther Party coming in. You also had some feminist groups working in collaboration with the Black Panther Party and talking about white supremacy, institutional racism. You also had some groups who were reflective of the working class white folks, also talking about racism. So whenever we talk about the history of racism, we typically tend to focus only on groups of particular groups, such as the Black Panther Party, civil rights folks. But there were a lot of different folks who were having these conversations about that resistance. And it's really important to remember that as well. And they were working in collaboration with each other. They weren't, there were times when there was this competition, or quote unquote, this competition, but a lot of times they worked in collaboration with one another. So I want to be frank about that. And I think that's something that we need to, not need, but I think it's something to make note of. One of the most notable groups that have been avid in their I have a lot of words. I have a lot of thoughts. Can't talk. Excuse me. One of the most notable groups that are working currently to resist institutional racism and white supremacy is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was formulated in 2013 after the death of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was I believe he was 17 at the time. He and I were the same age at that point in time. And he was killed he was racially profiled and killed by Andrew Zimmerman. And it was found, and Zimmerman was acquitted. He was found not guilty in murdering him. And I want to be clear, racial profiling has been it's been a very contested topic. It's been around for quite some time, and it is experienced by people of color. But I'll outline that in the next slide. But Black Lives Matter was formed in response to the to unarmed killings of people of color and racial profiling of people of color. And I want to be clear about Black Lives Matter. It's not just focusing only on single issues of racism. It's also looking at, it's providing this intersectional framework. So it doesn't just recognize the oppression of just Black men, because typically that is predominant focus of the media. There's also this focus on the oppression of Black women, overall just people of color, and recognizing the role that intersectionality plays in folks' experience. So looking at queer folks, queer Black folks, transgender, Black folks who identify as trans and as Black. So with the use of technology and social media and even mass media, there have been great recognitions and recognitions of resistance to institutional racism and white supremacy. So when we talk about racial profiling and police brutality, they tend to be some contested topics amongst folks. Several years ago, or even still now, we had the kneeling at the football games, right? Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. And it's also important to know that there have been others within earlier history that have protested racial profiling and police brutality. And the response was to silence them. Muhammad Ali, as a prime example, also known as Cassius Clay. So Muhammad Ali was very, very avid against racism and called it out when he could. However, what ended up happening, because he was so avid, because he was very passionate about it, there was attempts to strip him of his title and of the thing that he loved. Also, you also have a lot of celebrities who have been outspoken against racial profiling, police brutality. And when I mean celebrities, I'm talking about actors, actresses, musical artists. And this is a history, folks. But within the recent years, there's really this call to attention to racial profiling, police brutality. So we're going to talk about what that looks like. We're going to look at some of the statistics as well. So when we talk about racial profiling is basically suspecting someone of doing something based upon the observance of the characteristics of their racial group, not of that individual suspicion. So this might look like being followed in a store, being followed around grocery stores, around a jewelry store, or it may be at your apartment complex where you've explained to that person that you live there and they are hounding you and they're asking you for identification. These are examples of racial profiling. And I have some statistics here to show y'all about racial profiling, but let's move over to police brutality so we can talk a little bit about that as well. So when it comes to police brutality, typically what is assumed is that it's physical injury or verbal assaults. It's more than just that, or also death. It's more than just these. It's unjustified or intentional harassment. There's psychological injuries, property damage, um, due to the interaction with the police. So it's not just physical injuries or death or any type of verbal assaults. It's all of these different things. And what is typically captured on camera are those physical assaults or deaths, if you will. So um, what we have seen within recent years uh, is the attention to police brutality and racial profiling. But I do want to point out that racial profiling and police brutality experienced by people of color have been a thing for a very, very long time. It's just within recent years because we have people who have access to cameras, even in high definitions. Shout out to iPhones. Um, that was so messed up. Samsungs are okay too. Androids are okay too. But in essence, what you've had are people being able to film their experiences or the experiences of others to call to attention of these topics. So I'm going to get out of this and I'm going to show you some stats. So up here I have are some stats related to racial profiling and then also police brutality. So here it is. So we have a couple of statistics here. The first one, Black drivers are twice as likely to be arrested during a traffic stop. That was provided by the Leadership Conference. If we look here, white folks are twice more likely to receive a verbal warning for their conduct compared to Black folks. The probability of being Black, unarmed, and shot by the police is about 3.49 times the probability of being white, unarmed, and shot by the police on average. So what this is suggesting is that when it comes to being shot by the police and being unarmed, there is, if you are Black, there's a higher likelihood that you are going to be shot than if you are white. Okay. So switching over to, sorry. So switching over to police brutality, it's really, really, really important to recognize that only about a small fraction of agencies really track misconduct reports. So I want to be very clear here when it comes to police officers, there does seem to be a discrepancy when it comes to tracking. On average, it's not happening. And also, as well, there's less likely to be criminal indictments than actually to occur than none. So here we have the stats about police brutality. So I'm just gonna slowly scroll through. Number one, the first one, police officers are indicted in fewer than 1% of killings, but the indictment rate for civilians involved in a killing is 90%. This was by 538. When it comes to police officers taking a citizen's life, on average, it's every 7 hours. So another one here, the U.S., and this is by the U.S. Department of Justice. This is our own government, like, reporting this stuff. 52% of police officers report it's not unusual for law enforcement officials to turn a blind eye to improper conduct. So something that I want to be clear about, let me switch over back here. Something that I want to be clear about, I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about police officers, that they do put their lives on the line to provide safety. And at the same time, there are police officers who do abuse their power. We have documents, we have evidence to suggest that. And the issue that people are bringing to attention is the lack of accountability by those who are um, abusing their power. And that's really important because within the last decade, we haven't seen um, indictments of police officers who do police officers who abuse their power, engage in unjustified and excessive force. So I want to be clear here. I do recognize that it's really important for us to have the police. It is important. However, when it comes to people of color or certain groups of color, there is an adversive relationship, and that is something um, that is being called to attention uh, within recent years. What I also want to make note, when we think about police brutality, we also have to think about training. So there are uh, a lot of things that go into these things, such as racial profiling, police brutality. We have to think about the training of the police officers, the experience, and also cultural sensitivity. So taking all these things together are really, really important. We can't just go on and say that all police um, to say that all police practices, all policemen are racist. That is like a very, 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 very broad statement. What I do want to point out, is there implicit racism? Yes. To be quite clear, within the US America, everybody has implicit bias. Um, it's what we do with that bias is important. And it appears that when it comes to training, along with that bias, there's not a lot that is working there. They're not working with it. And if we're not working with that implicit bias, then those results, as we have seen, can be fatal towards certain groups, towards members of certain groups. So I want to be clear and say that when we talk about uh, police brutality and racial profiling by the police, we have to look at it through different dimensions and different perspectives. Because if we're only focusing on one side, if and we're bashing the other side and not listening to each other, then um, that creates a problem. And I'll outline that when I talk about allyship. So a word about cultural appropriation. So this has been a hot topic within the past couple years. And really, I think it's becoming a hot topic is because we have cameras now. We recognize that cultural appropriation has been a thing for quite some time within US American history. So when we talk about cultural appropriation, really what it is, you're taking pieces of somebody's culture. It might be a headpiece. It may be a dress, or it may be some type of clothing. It may be some type of tattoo, and it is used for aesthetic reasons. So it's a nice way of saying people use it to look pretty. Now that in particular can be of concern. especially when you have things that are being renamed. Now, here's where I think the area can get a little bit gray. Um, Talking about cultural appreciation. So here I have several folks in the on the slide. I do want to make a quick note, Beyonce, if you ever are watching this, I'm not saying you are being culturally appropriative. Um, this was just an example. Please don't, cancel me, and Beehive, please don't cancel me as well. I love you, Beyonce. I imagine you are a nice woman. Have mercy on me. I don't have much, so I'm sorry. Um, so there have been celebrities accused of culturally appropriating specific cultures. Uh, this young woman here with the red dress, this was she. From what I understand of the situation, she reported she wanted to show an appreciation of that particular culture, to which people were. There was a lot of anger amongst folks of that community, and as it could be. Now, here's where I want to play devil's advocate. Where do we draw the line between appropriation and appreciation? I know I just apologized to Beyonce, but for a lot of folks who love Beyonce, they thought that this look was beautiful. Same thing with Katy Perry. Katy Perry, it was considered a beautiful performance when she was wearing this garment. So my question is, where do we draw the line between appreciation and appropriation? So I outlined the definition of cultural appropriation, and how can we conceptualize cultural appreciation? So that's a thought for your thoughts. And I want to be clear, cultural appropriation is inappropriate. To pick aspects of a person's culture and um, and use it for your own use for aesthetic reasons to look pretty, that's inappropriate, and that's just plain fucked up. And there can be ways where a person can show their appreciation, and that might be uh, consulting with someone who is of that culture. Now, I want to be, let me scroll over to the slide. So really what you have on here are Bantu knots. And here's where I'm going with this. This is an example of, this is another one of those harder examples about if it's cultural appropriation or appreciation. So Bantu knots have been a thing for quite some time, and they've been practiced by women of color, in particular Black women with kinky curly hair. Now, some celebrities, I think it was Kim Kardashian at some point. No, I don't remember. But one of the celebrities was wearing Bantu knots, and people are asking, what are these? What is that? That's so chic. And people are like, oh, it's twisted mini buns. It's not twisted mini buns. Um, Bantu knots. Bantu knots have been worn by women of color for years. When we talk about hair practices, um, hair protection, wearing bonnets, um, these are things that we've learned since Egypt, since Egyptian times, even further than that. Hair protection has gone way back into Africa, way back to historical ancient Africa, to be quite frank. And when we name something different than what it is, then it becomes grounds for cultural appropriation. So just to throw that out there. So now we're going to talk about colorism. So with colorism, this is the process or system that privileges people with light skin over people with dark skin. So the focus here is on skin tone and hair. And a lot of times people talk about it with racism, and be quite clear, it operates with racism. And when it comes to colorism, there are some social consequences based upon skin tone and hair. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But it's important to go over where colorism originated. So colorism has roots within European colonial projects and slavery and even class hierarchies in Asia. So with classism in particular, um, classism is a system that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the quarter, but classism is the system that privileges um, people of upper class than those of the working class or below. Um, so within European colonial projects, those who were considered to be wealthy and of the upper class, they stayed indoors. Whereas those who were part of the working class or lower than that, they typically worked outdoors. So those who were working outdoors, they got a tan, and those who were, staying inside, who are wealthy, were paler than the other folks. And when we look at skin tone in that sense, skin tone suggested, you know, what uh, what class you were part of, and you were valued based upon that skin tone. So those who were wealthy, those who were rich, their skin tone was pale, and as a result, they were valued compared to those who were not rich or wealthy. We also saw this in the plantation life of African slaves. So slaves who were fair skinned or lighter skinned were allowed to be part of a higher hierarchy within these plantation life. So they were typically within the house. They were closer to the master compared to slaves with darker skin. Within class hierarchies in Asia, we see something very similar when it came to the European colonial project. Those who were wealthier, those who were um, part of the uh, upper class, were valued based upon their skin tone, or excuse me, they were staying indoors, and as a result, they were paler than those who were um, part of the working class or lower. So overall, when it comes to the history of colorism, it really focuses on this idea of skin tone, also as well as hair. But within history, there isn't a lot of documentation on that, besides within the plantation life of African slaves, uh, or um, those who were free, working to, trying to make their hair more manageable because there were discrimination laws. But other than that, that's pretty much that's where colorism originated from. So, what are the effects of colorism? Um, Colorism as a whole has a wide range of effects. Typically, people talk about perceptions of beauty and attraction as it focuses to women. However, there are other consequences associated with colorism, such as employment. So we do see evidence of color bias. So people with light skin earn a lot more money than those with dark skin. Now, when you put racism and colorism together, what you do see is a stratification. Those who are white earn more than those who are black. However, when you break it down into color stratification, you see that those with light skin, they make less money than white individuals, but they make more money than folks with darker skin. So when it comes to employment, we do see some evidence of color bias. Also, you do see you're more likely to see people with lighter skin in higher positions than those with darker skin. When it comes to education, people with lighter skin report higher educational attainment than those with dark skin. Also, not possible, but passing. So when it comes to passing, what it is that individual is identifying as white. So this is something that you've seen within earlier U.S. American history, where you had people of color who were very, very light that were able to pass as white. And as a result, they were able to obtain the advantages of being white. Now, I want to be clear, when it came to is someone finding out about that person's racial identity, there were some adverse consequences. In some cases, they were killed. In some cases, beaten. So it's really important to recognize that even though there was this attainment of advantages, there was risk associated with losing it. And even today as well, to be quite clear. The criminal justice system. So what we have seen when it comes to our comparison to those with light and dark skin, there are harsher sentences for people with dark skin compared to those with light skin. And then lastly, I initially talked about perceptions of beauty. But when it comes to perceptions of beauty, what we typically see is this emphasis on skin brightening, skin lightening. And it's typically advertised within communities of color, where you have sections where skin bleaching cream is placed in those areas. So if we look at Walmart, for example, if you were to go into, and I'm talking about Walmart in Ruston, if we were to go to the hair care aisle, notice that it is separate from, they're separated from each other. So when we talk about hair within the aisles of Walmart, the kinky, coily, or the ethnic or multicultural hair care products are separate from products whose consumers are typically white. If you've ever been to the Walmarts in Ruston, also if you're practicing social distancing, please be careful when you're going out to Walmart if you're trying to see this thing. If you go out to Walmart, so the neighborhood market and the big Walmart in Ruston, you'll notice that those sections are separate. And this is something that is very typical amongst big retailer stores. They're separated from each other. When you think about hair, they're very much the same thing. Hair is hair. Why is it that the products are separated? Also, what you do find within the multi-ethnic section, the quote-unquote multi-ethnic section, is skin bleaching cream. So within that same section of multi-ethnic hair care, you're also likely to see skin bleaching products as well. And it's also important to note that there are skin bleaching practices that are very common amongst communities of color. When we look, I have a link below, but there are folks practicing in skin bleaching, skin lightening practices to make themselves appear lighter skinned than they were before. And it's really important to recognize that certain products can be very harmful to your skin and can facilitate skin cancer. Now, here's the thing with skin color and ethnic identity. There's a catch-22 here. So those with light skin, they may not be viewed as ethnically authentic. So while they gain all the privileges from white supremacy, they're they experience this they experience this disadvantage. Uh, well, I don't want to say it is a disadvantage. It may be light skin may be viewed as a disadvantage. They may not be seen as authentic, so they may not be seen as Black enough or Latinx enough, so forth and so on. Uh, and this can be quite hurtful because in one area, or not hurtful, but this can be quite confusing because in one area you have privilege, you have um, the advantages, but in your own community, uh, you experience marginalization. So this is a catch-22 when it comes to colorism. Um, Within certain communities, people with light skin are seen as more assimilated into the dominant culture, and they're less identified with their ethnic community. So now we're going to look at microaggressions. And remember, we talked about microaggressions as these subtle slights um, that are targeted towards certain folks with certain identities. So with racial and colorist microaggressions, there's this focus as race and skin tone. And remember, we talked about microaggressions as being subtle and insidious. And over time, they're very, very harmful. If you think of them like mosquito bites, that's exactly what they are. So getting bit by a mosquito one time, it doesn't seem bad. It itches every now and then. But if you get bit like 5, 10 times a day, that gets aggravating because then you're just scratching all over. And I'll provide a link in reference to in reference to the video I'm talking about. The point is with microaggressions, there are people that get bit or people that receive microaggressions more than others. So I'm going to show you the different racial microaggressions. So we're going to exit out of this and then go to microaggressions. So racial microaggressions in everyday life. This was done by Daryl Ring Sue and his colleagues, and conceptualizing racial microaggressions. So if we scroll down here, nope, just keep scrolling. So here there's a list of different microaggressions. Now the focus is on therapeutic practices, but there are some microaggressions that we hear in daily conversation. Oops, hold on, let me keep scrolling. Wrong one, sorry folks. Where is it? Here it is. Yeah, they are. So these are the daily examples. So the question, where are you from? And if someone, if a person of color says, I'm from California, and the second question is, where are you really from? That is a microaggression because it's communicating a certain message that you're not American and you're a foreigner. Another one, let's see. You are so articulate. So remember we talked about those micro insults where the first half is a compliment, and then the second half is not so much a compliment. Saying you are so articulate to someone are really just assigning this intelligence to a certain person of color based upon their race. communicates that it's not usual for a person of that race to be smart. Another one that we typically see related to color blindness, there is only one race, the human race. America is a melting pot. In particular, that statement has been used for quite some time when we're talking about America. It's important to recognize that, yes, we have a wide variety of cultures that are here within US America, but it's also important to remember that they are distinct and they're not thrown in to give this particular flavor. And they have people have their own identities. And it communicates that we are to assimilate into we are to assimilate into the dominant culture. So these are just examples of microaggressions. I'll provide the article for you to take a look at. But when it comes to microaggressions and so specifically racial microaggressions and colorist microaggressions, they're very, very common and insidious. Oh, before I forget, I meant to show colorist microaggressions. I'll provide you with the link, but just to save time, some colorist microaggressions are, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl or a dark-skinned person. So here's that micro insult, right? This communicates that a person is pretty, but it's also communicating that people with dark skin are not pretty, or it's not usual for them to be pretty. Okay, so as long as you remember like those three types of microaggressions, micro insult, micro assault, and micro invalidations, recognizing like how they operate, you'll be able to identify and just be wary of your own language, because a lot of the times these things are said and they're not seen as harmful. So we talked a lot about the history of racism and colorism, how they operate, and about microaggressions. So how do we navigate all of that? Because these are some very contended topics, and they typically incite passion. And it's important to remember, to be, and I listed all these out here, but I'll sum it up in just a couple words. Being open, being humble, so being okay with getting it wrong, and remembering who you are is really, really important when it comes to allyship, in resistance to racism. A lot of times people don't know their own history in regards to their race or other people's race. It's really important to know the history of everyone. So what I'm not saying is only know your own history and go from there, or know other people's history, not your own. No, it's important to recognize the ways in which we are all connected through the system. And throughout history, we time and time again, we've learned the ways in which we're all connected by this system of oppression, especially when it comes to racism. And typically with racism, it fuels disconnection from other people. So remember, your history, our histories are very much connected with one another. And it's also important to recognize our histories are also distinct. So what I'm saying is, remember that we do share similarities. So recognize that and also appreciate those differences that we share at an equal amount, because from there that's when you learn and you connect with other people. And one of the bigger ones is knowing who you are. Really, it's just a lot of self-reflection when it comes to being an ally. When we do and say things, we have to question: is it out of genuine uh, beliefs against that oppression, or is it about us doing something? And here's an example. So going out, doing the work against racism, and saying, look at me, this is what I'm doing. Look at me, look at what I'm doing. I'm doing this work. Notice this constant I, this calling to attention. That's just as an example of what happens when you're going in and you're not doing it for that genuine purpose, for it really just being genuine, and it's about the clout. It's about power. It's about you. When you make it about you, that is when shit hits the fan. Okay. And one way of recognizing genuine interest is saying, this is the work that needs to be done. Calling attention to that form of oppression, as well as marginalization, so forth and so on. That's doing the work. So when it comes to being an ally, especially when it comes to racism and colorism, it's a lot of self-reflection. And if you don't know where you are, if you don't know who you are, it can become very easy to fall into the white savior or that savior role. And then lastly, something that's also important, being okay with getting it wrong. So a lot of times, and I think within this culture, there's this pressure to be right, to do things right. And I think it's important to recognize that, yes, don't be a harmful human. Don't throw microaggressions at people, right? Don't call people derogatory remarks, especially if they're racial or colorist remarks, for example. But when you get it wrong, take that feedback, look at it, examine it, and self-reflect. Because the minute there's this defense, that's where you diminish the work. So this lecture was about racism and colorism. We talked about a lot of heavy stuff, and the message that I want to convey is that don't find yourself on the opposite end, because entrenchment is not the best thing ever. Being in the middle, being okay with being in the middle is really important. Being able to see two sides of the same coin is important. And also, at the same time, know where you stand. Know who you are, and at the same time, be able to see other people's perspective. Because as soon as you stick on one end and say the other side is wrong, that's where the work is diminished. So if there are any terms or any concepts or information that was not clear, please feel free to email me. That's it.